The sun was already cruel by mid-morning, pouring down over the dust-swept settlement like molten copper. The kind of heat that dried sweat before it could bead, that made shadows look thin and insubstantial. In that little frontier town half, a dozen adobe huts, a weathered church, and a lean-to store, there was no shortage of superstition. Some of it came from the old countries the settlers had left behind, some from half-heard tales about Indian magic, and much from sheer fear of what they could not control. Evelyn Cross stood in the center of the dusty square, wrists bound, with rawhide, her straw-colored hair hanging limp from the heat. She wasn't crying, at least, not yet. She kept her chin level, though the jeers of the crowd stung sharper than the rope cutting into her skin. They called it a sentence, though no proper court had sat in judgment. In truth, it was the ruling of the town's elders, a few men, who thought their word was as good as law when law was 2 weeks' ride away. Her crime was written in no book: infertility. Evelyn had been married 3 years to Thomas Cross, a blacksmith whose lungs were always blackened with soot. They had no children through no fault she could name. But in the settlement's narrow eyes, a woman who bore no children was useless to her husband, a drain on the food supply, and worst of all, a bad omen. When Thomas died suddenly of fever, that summer, the whispers sharpened. She brought it, one woman hissed while filling her water pail. She's cursed. By autumn, the whispers had turned into something harder. It had happened before, never to someone Evelyn knew well. But she'd heard the stories in quiet dread. A barren woman, accused of carrying a curse, was taken to the desert's edge, buried upright to the neck, and left for the elements to decide her fate. They called it the desert's judgment. If she somehow survived until sundown, the curse was said to be broken. If she died, the town would nod grimly and say the desert had claimed what it must. No one had ever survived. The men who dragged her to the pit worked quickly, their boots scuffing the sand. Some avoided her gaze. Others smirked as if eager to see the spectacle done. Evelyn's heart pounded against her ribs, but she forced herself to breathe steadily. You could speak up, she told herself, over and over. You could beg. But the thought of giving them that satisfaction was almost worse than what lay ahead. The pit had been dug the night before, 3 feet deep, just wide enough for a body to fit. The smell of freshly turned sand was sharp in her nostrils. A thin wind whispered across the flats, carrying the faint scent of creosote bush. They shoved her in, the sand cool against her legs for a fleeting second. Then came the shovels, the sand raining down around her, creeping up her hips, her ribs, her shoulders. Her arms were pinned against her sides. Her breathing grew tight. She tilted her head back as the sand rose to her collarbone. One more shovels. Worth, and she was buried to her neck. The rawhide was cut from her wrists. There was no point keeping them tied. She couldn't move them anyway. The crowd stood around the rim for a while, watching her. A few muttered prayers. Others made the sign of the cross or touched the lucky charms in their pockets. Then, one by one, they left, until only the empty blue sky and the endless sand were her companions. The silence pressed in on her. Only the occasional whisper of wind broke it. Her scalp prickled under the heat. Within minutes, sweat trickled down the side of her face, stinging her eyes. She tried to shift, but the sand held her fast. Time became strange. She couldn't tell if minutes or hours passed. Her lips began to crack. Her mind circled the same questions. Why me? What if I'd left sooner? If I'd fought? She imagined the night coming, the cold cutting as deep as the day's heat had burned. Coyotes would pad near, their eyes glinting in the dark. The image twisted in her stomach. A hawk circled high above, casting a fleeting shadow across her face. She closed her eyes against the glare. For a heartbeat, she let herself pretend it was an angel's wing, that perhaps some hand of mercy might yet reach for her. The desert doesn't roar its threats, it whispers them. It doesn't have to shout, its patience is deadlier than any. Blade. Evelyn learned this in her first hour buried to the neck. The sun moved slowly but deliberately overhead, as if savoring its work. Heat shimmered on the horizon, making the distant scrub look like it floated on water that wasn't there. Evelyn licked her lips out of habit, forgetting there was nothing left to wet them. The taste was grit and copper. She tried to focus on faraway things, anything to make the here and now smaller. She thought of her mother's herb garden back in Missouri, how the bees hummed in the lavender, how cool the shade felt on her arms when she knelt to weed. But the memory was fragile. Each breath she took brought her back to the burning air and the unyielding grip of the sand around her ribs. By midday, her head felt heavier than her body. Sweat no longer ran. It had abandoned her. Flies, drawn by the scent of human salt, landed on her cheeks and eyelids. She jerked her head to dislodge them, but every motion cost more energy than she could spare. In the distance, a coyote yipped high and mocking. The sound carried across the flats like laughter at a cruel joke. Evelyn's throat tightened. She knew coyotes didn't usually attack humans, but they were scavengers. They would wait for night. Once, faint and far away, she thought she heard hoofbeats. Hope surged hot in her chest. She strained her neck, searching for dust rising on the horizon. Nothing. The silence returned, heavier than before, and her heartbeat slowed back to that weary, slow thud. The wind shifted sometime in the afternoon. It brought no relief, only a dusting of sand across her face. It settled in her eyelashes, clung to her hair, coated her tongue when she accidentally opened her mouth. The grittiness made her want to cough, but even that small violence would have caused too much moisture. Her thoughts began to drift. She saw things that weren't there, shadows that might have been clouds, shapes on the horizon that might have been people. At one point, she thought she saw Thomas, her late husband, walking toward her with his blacksmith's apron on. She even whispered his name. But the mirage shimmered and vanished into the glare. The hardest part was not the thirst, not yet, it was the stillness. She was a woman who had spent her life in motion, tending the stove, fetching water, kneading bread, scrubbing clothes. To be locked in place while the day burned itself out felt like being buried alive in time. Every so often, she tested the sand around her, wiggling her fingers, trying to push against the wall that held her. It was no use. The more she strained, the tighter it seemed to pack around her chest. The sun had begun its slow tilt toward the western hills when she felt the first true wave of dizziness. Her sight blurred at the edges, the world shrinking to a tight circle in the center of her vision. She realized then that she might not make it to nightfall. Somewhere in the haze, she heard it again, hooves. This time, closer. Not a mirage, not the trick of wind over rock. The rhythm was steady, purposeful, the sound of a single rider rather than a herd. She couldn't turn her head enough to see, but she found the strength to lift her voice hoarse, barely more than a breath. Help! The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped. Evelyn's pulse quickened, though she could no longer tell if it was hope or the final flicker of her strength. She waited, listening to the soft crunch of boots on sand. Someone was coming. The man riding toward her was alone, his figure etched against the molten sky. The horse beneath him moved with an easy, ground-eating gait, its coat the color of deep river mud, its mane wind-tossed and free. The rider sat straight in the saddle, not slouched as weary travelers often did. From the cut of his shoulders and the way his gaze swept the land, Evelyn knew this was no ranch hand wandering off his trail. Chenoa Redhawk was not a man given to needless detours. His journey this day had been simple. Trade at the settlement 2 ridges east, pick up the sugar his eldest had begged for, and return before sundown so the youngest wouldn't fret. His life was measured in such errands now. It had been since The fever took his wife. Every mile he rode was weighed against the needs of the 4 children waiting back at the homestead. But the desert had a way of showing you what it wanted you to see. Sometimes it was game for the pot. Sometimes a storm, rolling low. And sometimes, though not often, it was a thing you could not ride past. From half a mile out, he had noticed what at first looked like a weathered stump jutting from the sand. The desert was littered with such tricks: rude ends, old fence, posts, bleached cattle bones. But as his horse drew nearer, the shape shifted. It had a color no wood could take and moved faintly against the wind. His eyes narrowed. He slowed the horse, letting it pick its way closer while his hand dropped instinctively to the handle of the knife at his belt. The desert held more than mirages. A lone head sticking out of the earth could be a trap set by desperate men. The sound reached him. Not the cry of an animal, not the hiss of wind, but a human whisper, raw and ragged. One word. Help. Chenoa's grip on the reins tightened. He urged the horse forward, closing the last 50 yards in a steady, deliberate trot. What he saw made his breath hitch despite years of hard living. It was a woman pale as sun-bleached linen, lips cracked, eyes ringed with dust. The sand held her upright like a cruel embrace, swallowing her body from the neck down. Stray strands of yellow hair clung to her damp forehead. She blinked at him as though she wasn't certain he was real. He swung down from the saddle in one fluid motion, boots sinking slightly into the warm sand. "Can you hear me?" His voice was calm, low. He had learned long ago that panic was a fire you didn't feed. Her lips moved again. "Please." No more words were needed. Chenoa's knife flashed in the light as he stabbed it into the sand beside her, loosening the packed grains. The earth here was dry on top but heavier just beneath, clinging in clumps. He dug with both hands, his fingers working like claws, tossing the sand clear so it wouldn't fall back in. Each scoop freed another inch of her. Her breathing deepened, not yet steady but less shallow. He glanced at her face only once, reading the signs: no blood, no visible injury beyond the blistering on her cheeks. This was not an accident. This was the work of men. He didn't ask questions, not now. The desert didn't allow for long conversations when the sun still had teeth. When the sand was down to her waist, he pulled his canteen from the saddle horn and pressed it to her lips. She tried to gulp, but he tipped it slow, letting only a trickle past her tongue. Too much at once and she might choke or sicken. A faint cough escaped her throat. "Thank you," she rasped. He grunted a sound that might have been acknowledgement, or simply focus, and kept digging until the sand loosened entirely around her legs. Then he braced his hands beneath her arms and pulled her free. She was lighter than he expected, her body thin beneath the dust-streaked dress. When her feet touched the ground, they buckled. Without hesitation, he swept her into his arms, cradling her as if she were one of his own children after a fall. His horse shifted, sensing the urgency. Chenoa mounted in one practiced motion, the woman held securely against his chest. The horse turned toward the west on a touch of the reins, hooves striking the hardpan in a steady rhythm. Evelyn felt the movement beneath her, strong, deliberate. Her head rested against the unfamiliar firmness of his shoulder. The air rushing past cooled her burning skin, carrying the scent of horse and leather and something faintly smoky, like cedar burned long ago. She tried to speak, to ask who he was, but her voice was only a scrape of air. Chenoa glanced down briefly, his dark eyes unreadable. "Save your strength. We've got miles yet." She let her eyes close. For the first time since the elder's hands had shoved her into that pit, she allowed herself to believe she might see the next morning. Behind them, the pit remained, a hollow mark in the sand, one more cruelty in a land that remembered such things long after the people were gone. Ahead, The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows that stretched toward the distant hills where Chenoa's home waited. He didn't know yet who she was or why she'd been left to die. But he knew two things with certainty. She was now his responsibility, and whatever fate the desert had planned for her, he had just stolen her back from it. The sun was sliding toward the horizon when Chenoa reined in near a narrow wash. Here, the land dipped enough to offer some shade from a cluster of mesquite trees, their crooked limbs clawing at the cooling sky. The horse snorted and shook its head, grateful for the pause. Chenoa swung down carefully, still holding Evelyn against him. She had drifted in and out of a shallow half-sleep during the ride, her head rolling with the motion of the horse. Now her eyes blinked open, glassy with fatigue. "We'll stop here," he said, more to himself than to her. "You need water before the night comes on." He set her down gently on a patch of packed earth where the shade was deepest. She sank onto her side, one arm curling weakly against her chest. Every movement seemed to cost her Dot from his saddlebag. Chenoa pulled a folded wool blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. The desert's heat was deceptive. Once the sun dipped, the cold could gnaw as viciously as the day had burned. Evelyn tried to speak, but her throat caught. He handed her the canteen again. "Slow," he reminded her. This time she obeyed, letting each sip linger before swallowing. When she could finally manage words, they came hoarse and uneven. "Why? Why did you stop for me?" Chenoa paused mid-motion as he unpacked a small pouch of dried meat. He looked at her for a long moment, the lines around his eyes deep in the fading light. "Because leaving you there would make me the same as the ones who put you in." She shivered under the blanket, though the air was still warm. You think it was people?" His voice was quiet but certain. "That wasn't nature's doing. Sand doesn't bury folks neat to the neck. Men do that." A flicker of memory made her close her eyes, hands shoving her down, voices muttering about. Curses. She fought the urge to shrink into herself. He didn't press her for more. Instead, he tore a piece of dried venison and held it out. She hesitated. Her stomach knotted from thirst and fear, but hunger won. The salt stung her tongue, but the taste brought a small spark of life back to her Dot as she chewed. Chenoa crouched near the wash, scanning the distance. The land was quiet in that tense way the desert sometimes was. No wind, no bird call, just the hum of silence. His instincts told him they had not been followed, but instincts weren't perfect. "What's your name?" he asked without looking at her. Evelyn Cross." His gaze shifted to her again, as if filing the name away. "I'm Chenoa Redhawk." The sound of his name was steady, grounding. Something about the way he spoke it, without hurry, without pride, told her this was a man who measured his words carefully. "You have people?" she asked. "4 children," he said simply. No embellishment, no explanation about how he had come to raise them alone. The fact was enough. She imagined the scene. 4 pairs of young eyes watching as their father rode home with a strange, dust-streaked woman draped in his blanket. It seemed almost absurd. "Why take me there?" she asked, not quite able to keep the edge of suspicion from her tone. He met her gaze levelly. "Because you won't live another night in the open. And I don't leave anyone for the coyotes." There was no boasting in his voice, only a statement of fact. She found herself believing him. They rested there for nearly an hour, the sky deepening from gold to purple. Evelyn's breathing steadied, though every so often she felt her body jolt with the aftershocks of fear. She caught herself watching him when he moved, how he checked the cinch on his saddle, how his hands worked with quiet efficiency. He carried himself like a man who had spent his life answering to no one but himself, and those he loved. When the first stars began to prick through the twilight, he stamped out their small fire and helped her to her feet. "We've got a few more miles," he said. My oldest will have supper waiting. You'll eat, then sleep. We'll talk tomorrow. She didn't argue. Her legs were unsteady, but he supported her easily as they mounted again. The horse shifted under their combined weight but did not. Balked out as they rode west, Evelyn felt the desert stretch out behind them like a shadow she wasn't sure she'd ever fully outrun. But with each mile, the grip of that pit seemed to loosen in her mind. Somewhere ahead lay a house full of children who didn't yet know her name, and a man who had decided without question or hesitation that her life was worth saving. The first time since Thomas's death, the horizon didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something she couldn't name yet. The last light of day clung stubbornly to the ridges, painting them in rusty orange and deep violet. Chenoweth's homestead came into view only when they crested the final low hill, a weathered cabin built of hand-hewn logs, its windows glowing faintly from within. Smoke rose in a thin line from the chimney, curling into the cooling sky. Evelyn felt her shoulders sag, though she didn't realize she'd been holding herself rigid the whole ride. She had never seen this place before, but it was the first sight in days, maybe weeks, that didn't look ready to devour her. A dog barked sharply from the yard. Chenoweth's horse slowed, ears flicking forward. "Easy," he murmured, both to the animal beneath him and the one guarding the cabin. The barking stopped, replaced by the sound of the cabin door swinging open. A tall boy, perhaps 15, stepped onto the porch. The firelight behind him turned his silhouette into a dark cutout, but Evelyn could see the glint of surprise in his eyes when he spotted her. "Pa?" The boy called, voice cautious. "It's me," Chenoweth answered. He guided the horse into the yard. Stopping just shy of the porch dot, the boy stepped closer, his gaze flicking from his father to the strange woman in his arms. "Whose?" "She's hurt. Been in the desert too long. Get the others." The boy didn't ask more. He disappeared inside, and moments later, 3 smaller figures spilled out into the yard, a girl of about 12, a boy of 8, and the youngest, a little girl, who couldn't have been more than 5. They clustered at the porch steps, whispering to each other in quick bursts. Evelyn felt her face flush under their curious stares. Chenoweth dismounted smoothly, keeping one arm around her until her feet touched the ground. "Inside," he told her quietly, steering her toward the open door. The interior smelled of wood smoke and stew, warm and sharp with onions and wild herbs. The small space was tidy, each object with its place. Blankets folded on a bench, a shelf lined with jars of preserves, a row of boots by the hearth. "Sit," Chenoweth said, nodding toward a chair near the fire. Evelyn obeyed, sinking into it. With a grateful sigh, the oldest boy, broad-shouldered like his father, was already ladling stew into a bowl. He set it on the table with a slice of cornbread beside it. "You'll eat slow," Chenoweth warned, handing her a spoon. "Your stomach's not ready for more than a little at a time." Evelyn nodded, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped the spoon. The first bite was almost too much hot, rich, tasting of rabbit and wild sage. She swallowed carefully, savoring the heat sliding down her throat. The children lingered nearby, watching openly. Chenoweth noticed and motioned them toward the far side of the room. "Let her be," he said, his tone even but firm. The oldest girl, dark hair braided down. Her back tilted her head toward Evelyn. "Is she staying here, Pa?" "For now." The little one piped up before she could be hushed. "What's her name?" Chenoweth glanced at Evelyn, leaving the answer to her. "Evelyn," she said softly, offering the faintest smile. The youngest grinned back, apparently satisfied. When Evelyn had eaten a few more slow spoonfuls, Chenoweth crouched beside her chair. "Tomorrow, you tell me what happened. Tonight, you rest." She looked at him for a moment, the words lodging in her throat. No one had said rest to her in months. "Thank you," she managed. He stood, nodding once. We'll set you up in the loft. It's warmest there." The oldest boy fetched an extra quilt while the two middle children scurried to carry up a small oil lamp. Evelyn followed Chenoa up the narrow ladder, her legs still unsteady but stronger than before. The loft was small but cozy, with a low ceiling and a mattress tucked into the far corner. A single window let in the last traces of twilight. "Sleep," Chenoa said simply. Setting the quilt at the foot of the bed, Evelyn sat on the mattress, watching him descend the ladder. She heard his voice murmur something to the children below, followed by the faint scrape of chairs and the closing of the cabin door for the night. She lay back, the quilt pulled to her chin. The sounds of the homestead murmured conversation. The pop of the fire lulled her. She thought of the pit in the desert, of the sun burning her eyes, of the moment she had first seen him riding toward her, for the first time in a long time. Her last waking thought was not of fear, but of safety. Morning came quietly in Chenoa's cabin. Evelyn woke to the faint smell of coffee and the low creak of floorboards beneath careful footsteps. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. The loft's small window let in a slice of dawn, painting the quilt in pale gold. The bed was warm, the air cool on her cheeks. Then memory returned: sun, sand, the shadow of a rider. She sat up slowly, her body stiff but stronger than the day before. Below, she could hear the children talking in soft bursts, trying not to wake her. Their voices carried the music of familiarity with one another, the eldest's steady authority, the middle boy's restless energy, the younger girl's bright chatter. Chenoa's voice cut through, low but not unkind. "Eat first, then chores." Evelyn found herself smiling faintly. It had been years since she'd woken to the sound of a family moving through the morning together. When she climbed down the ladder, Chenoa was by the stove, pouring coffee into a tin cup. He glanced up at her but didn't stop what he was doing. "You slept," he said. She nodded, like a stone. He slid the cup across the table toward her. "It'll warm you." The children were already at the table, bread and fried eggs in front of them. The eldest girl, Maya, she introduced. Herself handed Evelyn a plate without hesitation. The two younger ones mumbled good morning around mouthfuls. Evelyn sat gingerly, aware of her plain dress and the dust still clinging to its seams. She'd been given a wash basin and fresh water before bed, but she still felt like the desert was clinging to her in ways no cloth could hide. After breakfast, the cabin hummed with activity. Maya and the younger girl swept the floor and began kneading bread dough. The boys hauled in wood from a stacked pile near the shed. Chenoa checked the corral fencing before heading to the well. Evelyn wanted to help. She rose and offered to wash the dishes, but Maya shook her head. "Pa said you're to rest. Said your bones are still hollow from the sun." The phrasing made Evelyn chuckle, though there was truth in it. Still, she found herself wiping the table and tidying the cups, unable to sit idle. By mid-morning, she stepped outside for the first time since arriving. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of mesquite and the faint smoke from the chimney. She could see the line of the desert stretching away beyond the hills, but from here it seemed distant, almost like a bad dream. Chenoa returned from the well with 2 full buckets, setting them down near the door. "You feeling stronger?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Then, after a pause, "I don't know how to thank you." He shrugged, as if thanks were unnecessary. It was the right thing to do. For the rest of the day, Evelyn moved between resting and small tasks, mending a tear in one of the boys' shirts, peeling potatoes, showing Maya a quicker way to hem a skirt. The children began to ask her questions: where she came from, what she could cook, whether she could read. When she told them she could, the youngest girl's eyes lit up. That night after supper, Evelyn found herself reading aloud from an old Bible in the firelight. The children clustered close. Chenoa sat at the table, whittling something from a fada piece of cedar, his quiet attention a steady presence in the room. It struck Evelyn then this was what safety felt like. Not the absence of danger, but the presence of people who would stand between you and it. Still, she knew the desert wasn't done with her. The pit in the sand, the faces of those who had left her there, those things hadn't vanished. But here, in this small warm cabin, the fear had been pushed back far enough that she could breathe without tasting dust. When the children went to bed, Chenoa glanced at her from across the table. "Tomorrow you tell me everything," he said quietly. Evelyn met his gaze. She knew he meant to understand what danger might still be coming. And she also knew that telling the truth would mean letting someone else share the weight she'd carried alone for far too long. But tonight, she decided, could still belong to peace. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Evelyn hadn't known she'd been craving. Morning light spilled through the loft window, followed by the smell of coffee and the quiet shuffle of the household coming to life. At first, she still woke. With a start, half expecting to find herself buried in sand again, the dream and memory braided too tightly together. But each time she opened her eyes, the quilt was still over her, the murmur of voices still carried up from the kitchen, and she began to believe she was truly safe, at least for now. Her strength returned slowly. The desert had stripped her down to something brittle, and rebuilding took more than food and water. Chenoa didn't rush her. He had the patient manner of someone who understood that healing, whether from illness, grief, or sunburn, happened in its own time. The children were less restrained. Maya, the eldest girl, seemed to adopt Evelyn as though she'd always been there, showing her where the flour was stored and how to close the shutters before a dust wind. The middle boy, Eli, was full of restless questions: how far she had traveled, whether she'd ever shot a rifle, if she could teach him to write his name without smudging the ink. The youngest two, Luke and little Sarah, simply liked being near her, often pressing up against her side while she mended clothes or read aloud in the evenings. It was in those small moments that Evelyn felt the knots inside her begin to loosen. She caught herself humming while she worked. She began wearing her hair down in the evenings, letting Sarah braid it in lopsided plaits. And when she laughed at Eli's antics one afternoon, the sound startled her. It had been months since she'd heard it from her own mouth. She also began to notice Chenoa more. Not in the way she might have in her girlhood, fluttering glances and quickened heartbeats, but with the steady awareness of a woman who recognized reliability when she saw it. He was up before dawn, tending to the livestock, chopping wood, riding out to check the water troughs. He never spoke more than was necessary, but when he did, his words had weight. One evening, as they cleared the table after supper, she thanked him again for taking her in. He only said, "It's no burden to do what's right," but the faint curve of his mouth told her he understood she meant more than the meal. The desert, however, had a long memory. Evelyn knew it was only a matter of time before word reached the people who had left her to die. The settlement wasn't far, not far enough. She could feel the shadow of it sometimes, like a cold current under the warm surface of her new life. Her fears weren't entirely unfounded. Late one afternoon, Chenoa returned from a supply trip with news. He'd seen two men from her former settlement in the trading post. They hadn't spoken to him, but their eyes had lingered. "They'll be talking about you," he said simply, setting down a sack of flour. Evelyn's fingers tightened on the dish she was drying. "They already have," she murmured. He studied her face for a moment, then said, "We'll deal with it if it comes. You're not alone now." The words settled over her like another quilt, warm and heavy. She wasn't used to someone claiming her defense so openly. To distract herself from the unease, Evelyn threw herself into helping more on the homestead. She repaired a torn saddlebag, taught Eli his letters, and helped Maya dye a length of muslin with boiled onion skins for a new dress. She even baked a batch of biscuits using her mother's recipe, watching with quiet satisfaction as the children tore into them, butter melting down their fingers. The cabin felt fuller with her in it, and though no one said as much, she could tell the children had begun to count on her presence. Sarah started leaving her rag doll on Evelyn's pillow each morning so you don't wake up lonely. Eli proudly showed her the first letter he wrote without smudging. Maya asked if she might wear the dress Evelyn had helped sew for Sunday church. One night, after the younger ones had gone to bed, Evelyn sat by the fire mending a shirt while Chenoa sharpened his knife at the table. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel was oddly comforting. She glanced at him, the firelight catching the angles of his face. "You've built something strong here," she said quietly. He looked up. "It takes work, every day." She nodded, thinking of the way he spoke as if he were talking about more than the cabin and land. As if he meant the people inside it, and for the first time since the desert had tried to claim her, Evelyn began to think she might belong somewhere again. The change began with a single writer. It was late afternoon, the air heavy with that stillness that sometimes fell before dusk. Evelyn was outside, pinning the last of the week's wash to the line, when she caught sight of a figure moving along the ridge. Too far to make out the face, but close enough that the glint of sunlight on metal, likely a rifle barrel, was unmistakable. She froze, one damp sheet in her hands. The rider didn't approach the homestead. He lingered for a time, his horse shifting under him, then turned and disappeared behind the ridge. That night, she mentioned it to Chenoa as they sat at the table after the children had gone to bed. He didn't look surprised. "They're watching," he said simply. Her stomach nodded. "From the settlement?" "Likely. I've seen sign hoof prints near the lower creek bed, a place where someone camped not far from the road inn." Evelyn wanted to ask what they might do, but she could read the answer in his face before the words formed. He wasn't the kind to run from trouble, but neither was he the kind to stir it without need. In the days that followed, she became acutely aware of the land beyond the homestead. Every stretch of open ground felt like an invitation for eyes to find her. When she went to the well, she scanned the horizon. When she hung the wash, she kept her back close to the cabin. The children sensed the shift, though they didn't understand it. Eli asked why his father had started keeping the rifle propped by the door during the day. Maya wanted to know why she and Evelyn no longer walked into the hills to gather herbs. Just until things settle, Chenoa told them, but Evelyn knew. The truth, things would not settle, not while the settlement saw her as unfinished business. One evening, after the supper dishes were stacked and the cabin had gone quiet, Chenoa spoke. "Tell me exactly what happened that day." She hesitated. The memory was a wound she had kept stitched closed for her own survival. But his eyes held steady on hers, and she felt that same strange mixture of safety and inevitability she had felt the day he dug her from the sand. "They said I was cursed," she began, "because Thomas and I had no children. When he died, they said it was proof I brought sickness into his house. The elders met. They didn't tell me. 2 of the men came for me while I was drawing water. They tied my hands, walked me out, beyond the last fence post. I thought," she stopped, swallowing hard, "I thought maybe they were banishing me. But then I saw the pit." She described the way they'd filled it, the weight of the sand, the sun's glare, the sound of their boots walking away. Chenoa listened without interruption. When she finished, his jaw was set, but his voice was even. "They'll want to finish what they started. That kind of hatred doesn't turn quiet." The words made her shiver, though she knew he was right. 2 days later, proof came. Maya returned from the creek with a strip of cloth clutched in her hand, a man's neckerchief, red with a black border. She'd found it snagged on a mesquite branch not 50 yards from where she'd been filling the water pail. They were close, Evelyn said, her voice low. "Closer than I like," Chenoa agreed. He glanced toward the children, who were busy with their evening bread. We'll keep the rifle loaded, and I'll speak to the Whitlock place, they're friends. If trouble comes, they'll ride with us. That night, Evelyn lay in the loft staring at the sliver of moon through the window. The safety she had found here felt fragile now, like glass under pressure. But beneath the fear was another sensation, something she couldn't name yet, that came from knowing she was no longer facing this alone. Downstairs, she heard Chenoa's boots cross the floor, the metallic click of him checking the rifle. The sound was steady, deliberate, the work of a man preparing for whatever might come, and Evelyn, listening in the dark, made herself a silent promise. If the desert tried to claim her again, she would not go quietly. Not this time. They came at mid-morning, riding hard enough to raise a ribbon of dust behind them. Evelyn saw them first through the loft window, 3 men, all from the settlement. She recognized 2 immediately. Caleb Dross, with his narrow eyes and habit of spitting before he spoke, and Levi Grange, who had been one of the men to shovel the sand over her that day. The third was younger, but his posture carried the same arrogance. Her first thought was for the children. She went down the ladder quickly. "Chenoa," she said, her voice tight. "They're coming." He didn't ask who they were. He stepped to the corner by the door, took up the rifle, and checked the chamber. "Maya, take the little ones to the root cellar. Stay quiet. Eli, you go too." The children obeyed without protest, their faces pale. Evelyn helped shepherd them out the back, then returned to find Chenoa standing just outside the cabin, the rifle held easy but ready. The riders slowed as they approached, reining in about 20 feet from the porch. Dust swirled around there. "Horses' legs. Red Hawk," Caleb called. "You've got something that belongs to us." Chenoa didn't move. "I don't take what isn't mine." "You've got our problem living under your roof," Levi said, his mouth twisting into something that might have been a smile if it weren't so full of malice. "We buried her for good reason." Evelyn stepped into the doorway before Chenoa could answer. "You buried me because I wouldn't fit your narrow little measure of what a woman's worth." Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled at her sides. Caleb spat into the dust. "You're cursed. You bring sickness. You'll bring it here too." Chenoa's voice was like stone. "You ride to my land and speak threats in front of my home. You answer to me. You want to hurt her, you'll go through me first." Levi leaned forward in his saddle. "You think we won't? Apache or not, you've got 4 mouths to feed. You can't afford a fight." Chenoa raised the rifle, not aiming, but holding it where they could see it steady in his hands. "Try me." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. The men shifted in their saddles, weighing the distance, the steadiness of his stance. Evelyn knew they were also thinking about the Whitlock family, about how quickly word could spread if they pushed this into blood. "You'll regret this," Caleb said finally. He jerked his reins, and the 3 of them wheeled their horses away. Evelyn stayed in the doorway, watching the dust trail fade into the distance. Only when it was gone did she realize she'd been holding her breath. Chenoa lowered the rifle and turned toward her. "They'll be back," he said. It wasn't fear in his voice, just certainty. "Then I'll be ready," she said, surprising herself as much as him. The children crept back from the root cellar, their eyes wide. Evelyn knelt to meet them. "They're gone for now, and we're together. That's what matters." Maya looked at her with a seriousness far beyond her years. "You're not leaving, are you?" Evelyn shook her head. "Not unless your pay sends me away, and I don't think he will." Chenoa's eyes met hers briefly, something unspoken passing between them. The rest of the day moved in a strange, taut quiet. Chores were done, animals fed, bread baked, but always with one ear to the horizon. Evelyn helped Sarah sew a new dress for her rag doll, though her stitches were tighter than usual, her hands unwilling to be idle. That night, after the children were asleep, Chenua sat at the table cleaning his rifle. Evelyn poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him. "They'll test you again," she said. "They'll test us," he corrected, "and we'll stand." For the first time since she'd come here, Evelyn realized she was no longer thinking of herself as a guest or a burden, but as part of the we he spoke of. The thought was as solid and grounding as the rifle resting across his knees. Whatever came next, she wasn't alone in it anymore. The writers didn't return the next day, nor the one after, but the tension in the household didn't vanish. It settled into something quieter, a watchfulness that became part of their routine. Chenua kept his rifle close when he worked outside. Evelyn carried a small pistol when she went to the well. The children learned not to wander far without an adult. Weeks passed this way, the desert shifting from the pale gold of early autumn toward the muted browns of winter. The threat from the settlement still loomed, but it never materialized. Perhaps the men had decided Chenua was not worth provoking. Or perhaps they were simply waiting for another opportunity. Evelyn stopped trying to guess. Life here demanded too much immediate attention to waste energy on shadows. The change in her came gradually. She no longer startled at every sound beyond the cabin walls. She slept through the night more often than not. Her hands, once chapped from neglect, grew strong and sure with daily work kneading bread, mending clothes, lifting buckets from the well. It wasn't lost on her that she had begun speaking of the homestead as ours when talking to the children. One afternoon, Eli pointed it out with the bluntness only a boy could manage. "You talk like you live here for good," he said, squinting at her as they shelled beans together. She smiled. "Maybe I do." He considered this seriously, then nodded. "Good. You make better biscuits than pay." That evening, after supper, Maya brought Evelyn a folded piece of paper. On it was a drawing 5 figures holding hands under a crooked-roofed cabin. Evelyn recognized herself immediately, her long hair drawn in thick lines. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Is this us?" she asked. Maya nodded. "It's our family now." The words struck deep, not because they were sentimental, but because they were said with such certainty. Evelyn realized then that the children had claimed her long before she had allowed herself to believe she belonged here. Later, after the children were asleep, she found Chenua on the porch. The night was cool, stars sharp against the dark. She handed him the drawing. He studied it for a long moment before speaking. "They see you as part of this. And you?" she asked quietly. He looked at her then, the firelight from inside catching in his eyes. "I already did the day I dug you out." She didn't reply, not with words. But the heaviness she had carried since the desert lifted a little more. By the time winter truly arrived, the rhythm of life had fully claimed her. There was wood to chop, animals to feed, mending to finish before the cold set in. On Sundays they rode together to the Whitlocks for church and supper, and Evelyn noticed how people there greeted her as though she had always been part of Chenua's household. One night, a hard frost whitening the ground outside, Chenua set a steaming mug of tea in front of her. "You could go anywhere now," he said. "You've got your strength back. No one would stop you." She met his gaze steadily. "I don't want to go anywhere." He nodded once as if he'd been waiting for the answer but hadn't wanted to assume it. "Then this is your home." It was the first time he'd said it outright, and the words were like an anchor, heavy in a way that held her steady, not weighed her down. When spring came, Evelyn planted a small garden by the south fence, children helping her turn the soil. As they worked, she realized the earth here was nothing like the pit she'd been buried in. This ground held life. And now, so did she. The men from the settlement never did return. Maybe they decided she was too well guarded. Or maybe they knew the desert had already tried and failed to take her. Either way, Evelyn no longer measured her days by fear. She measured them by the bread she baked, the rows of beans in the garden, the sound of children's laughter on the wind, and the quiet presence of a man who had once pulled her from death and, without asking for anything in return, given her a life worth keeping. For the first time in years, she looked toward the future not with dread, but with something that felt very much like hope. That's the close Evelyn's survival turns into belonging, and belonging into family.